Okay, let's begin. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Chris Baglow. I'm the Academic Director of the Science and Religion Initiative in the McGrath Institute for Church Life here at the University of Notre Dame. The great Dominican theologian Yves Congar, whose theology of tradition was an enlightening and animating force at the Second Vatican Council, once wrote of the Church's tradition that, quote, "It cannot be reduced to the mechanical transmission of inert objects. Tradition is living," he continued, "because it is carried by living minds, minds living in time, which lead them to endow tradition with the reactions and characteristics of a living thing: adaptation, reaction, growth, and fruitfulness. The unhappy alternative is a caricature of tradition that is rigid, documentary, and static." The phrase mechanical transmission is perhaps the best summary of the danger of digitalization. It can freeze tradition even while superficially representing it, creating a situation in which machine learning replaces vitality and development is stunted by the artificial synthesis of text, sacred art, and other precious monuments that could otherwise be unique and living objects of transmission within a community. But there is hope in the midst of such peril, and this is one of the shared virtues of the members of this panel assembly. All three will not only represent the dangers, but will also help us carefully discern how to best wield the two-edged sword of technology. With this in mind, allow me to introduce them. Our first presenter, Walter Shire, is the Dennis Doughty Collegiate Professor of Engineering in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering here at the University of Notre Dame. He is a global AI leader, as well as a cultural critic and historian. Our second presenter, Bo Bonner, is a PhD theology student at the Maryville Institute and headmaster of the Mother of Good Counsel Preparatory School in Des Moines, Iowa. Bo's research includes Catholic social teaching and the technocratic paradigm. Last but not least is my colleague, Brett Robinson from the McGrath Institute, who serves as the Associate Director for Outreach there and is an Associate Professor of the practice. In this role, he oversees outreach efforts for the Institute while doing research on media and church history. So without further ado, I give the floor to our first presenter, Professor Walter Shire.
Great, thank you so much, Chris, for that generous introduction. Let's dive right into it. I am sure that you have seen placards like these in your travels, but have you ever considered where those words, cultural heritage, come from? Cultural heritage is the term du jour for rebranding functional objects and spaces constructed in the past as significant artifacts that have helped bring us to this present moment, but no longer serve their original purpose. This tends to be especially prevalent in spiritual contexts where there is some appreciation of a tradition by the contemporary culture, but not enough to maintain its continuity. I know these words well because I work in an interdisciplinary specialization of the humanities known as heritage science, which brings advanced digital technologies like artificial intelligence to the study, preservation, and exhibition of historical objects. And within that specialization, I'm a rare bird, a practicing Catholic with a vested interest in the original purpose of the objects of study. Here's a little story. Last year, I found myself at a workshop on digital paleography with an emphasis on biblical papyri and manuscripts, which happened to be held on a weekend. Paying due attention to my Sunday obligation, I skipped a morning session and was met when I returned with lighthearted jeers from my colleagues, who had assumed I had overslept after the previous night's after-hours convening at a local bar. My explanation that I was perhaps the only computer scientist working in heritage science who believed what our data sets were telling us fell flat. With a mixed look of puzzlement and horror, a conservator from Cambridge blurted out, but what period was it?" "Was what?" I responded. "The church," she exclaimed. "Early 20th century with a pre-Vatican II altar preserved. It's beautiful. You should walk down there and take a look," I replied. Such a reaction is emblematic of the cultural state of affairs in academia today. Cultural heritage projects tend to decommission things in the physical world and set them up to be reconstructed virtually. For instance, the tourist sees the language of cultural heritage peppered throughout explanatory signage as they tour one of Europe's great churches, which is covered in scaffolding so that photographers can digitally scan the building to turn it into a manipulable 3D model. Quarried stones and stained glass windows are replaced with computer graphics, digital elements that can be reabsorbed into culture by any interpreter in any desired configuration, regardless of their true function. What is lost in this campaign? Only what we willingly give up. In April 2021, the Italian design magazine Interni published an article on Livio De Luca, an architect, engineer, and computer scientist who serves as the scientific coordinator of the Cathedral of Notre Dame's digital presence. I'm gonna quote from this article, and it's a translation, so bear with this translation. It is not mine. I do not speak Italian. It's a little rough. I'll try to do some further translation as we move through this, because some of these words are very important. According to the article, it is thanks to him we entered this extraordinary world, which starts from the real, passes into the digital, and then returns to the most extreme physicality, that of a new cathedral identical to the lost one. The article goes on. A cognitive and semantic investigation, that of the scientific site, which supports and accompanies the operational site and which helps it, for example, to recompose by anastylosis, which is when a ruined building is recomposed using original materials from that building and also some modern materials where necessary. But it is also has its own value regardless. This ecosystem will be able to memorize a situation that will not necessarily be expressed by the restoration site, but will remain an important digital memory that already today reveals technical constructive details, in this case linked to the Gothic style, which before they didn't know each other. A digital-born cultural heritage that will also become a valuable tool for future researchers. So doing some further translation here, what this text is trying to tell us is that this digital version is in fact superior. We're gaining new knowledge from the digitized version, something we couldn't get from the original building, allegedly. Okay, so this raises three questions. Number one, why exactly is this happening? Surely the AI boom isn't the sole driver of this phenomenon. What are the underlying social causes? Number two, what are the limits of this project? Reductionist tendencies in science have not always panned out. Is it possible to set some bounds around what is possible? Number three, is there anything worth salvaging from this project? The internet, of which AI and all of these interesting related technologies are a feature, is very popular. What good can be emphasized here, right? So we don't want to throw everything out. We sort of want to rein this back in. Okay, let's start with the first part. Why is this happening? In the controversial 2016 BBC documentary Hypernormalization, the filmmaker Adam Curtis suggested that contemporary life has become a never-ending stream of extraordinary events that governments are no longer capable of responding to. The reason for this, according to Curtis, is that politicians, business leaders, and technological utopians have conspired to replace the boggling complexities of the real world with a much simpler virtual world, facilitated by revolutionary advances in computing. By retreating to the virtual world, it's possible to escape the everyday trials of terrorism, war, financial collapse, and other catastrophes that regularly plague the globe without confronting them in any serious way. The film is both compelling and highly entertaining, introducing its audience to a vast array of eccentric figures, famous and obscure, who had an outsized influence on the virtualization of life. Critics were mixed in their reaction to the film, in some cases not being able to make sense of the patchwork of concepts presented. With coverage of everything from UFOs to computer hackers, one couldn't exactly blame them. But this is the tangled logic of the internet that we now inhabit. The term hypernormalization comes from the anthropologist Yuri Yurchak, who used it to describe the latter days of the Soviet Union, where it was seemingly impossible to imagine anything but the status quo. Soviet politicians and citizens participated in what was a mere charade of a functioning society. Eventually, that charade became a norm. This effect is what hypernormalization is meant to describe. So why are the leading technology powers obsessed with virtualizing the world? And important for our key topic today, why are they underwriting cultural heritage projects? Much of the funding, of course, comes from these two particular governments. The answer comes down to the notion of perceived safety. It is easier to surveil your population in the virtual world. That is because you are the builder of that environment. Jeremy Bentham envisions something similar in the physical world with his famous panopticon. The building circular, an iron cage, glazed, a glass lantern about the size of Ranelagh, the prisoners in their cells occupying the circumference, the officers the center. By blinds and other contrivances, the inspectors concealed from the observation of the prisoners, hence the sentiment of a sort of invisible omnipresence. The whole circuit reviewable with little or, if necessary, without any change of place. I think it's very interesting that Bentham describes this surveillance apparatus as a circuit. All of this makes sense for Chinese virtualization, but America is also surveilling its population through this infrastructure, but as a mechanism for economic extraction. The Portuguese writer and politician Bruno Marques has proposed that the United States and China are now locked into a technological competition that resembles a video game, in which each's virtual environment is put up as the dominant model. He argues in his recent book, World Builders, that, quote, technology has triggered strong competitive dynamics because we have entered an age when superpowers are actively rebuilding the world. He goes on. Just as new technologies slowly raised the destructive potential of direct conflict, a new avenue was opened. States can now fight one another not by winning in a direct battle, but by setting the rules under which other states must operate. Call it a form of indirect government. Perhaps your opponent will even assume the rules are natural or given. But in reality, you have moved one level up in the great game. Your opponent is playing a video game. You are coding it. The question is whether this is actually a safer form of great power politics. Let's return now to this disingenuous phrase, cultural heritage. We can ask why the project we have been talking about, regardless of where it is located, seeks so desperately to disenchant the world. Where does that fit into this regime of safety? Socialism and liberalism seek out the same enemies under the guise of safety. Perhaps this is a further consequence of the utilitarianism underlying all of this thinking. When it comes to religion, root out the threat to the state or individual rights while simultaneously increasing expected cultural value. It's a big win in this video game. Okay, so of course there are some limits here, especially if one is a reasonable thinker. Let's come back to the concept of hypernormalization. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991. This should have served as a warning to any large bureaucratic organization pushing charades to become the norm. But of course, it doesn't. In an earlier film, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, Curtis examined the folly of computational simplifications. A key sequence in the film traces the origin of the idea that computers can model any aspect of the universe, known and unknown. In his landmark book published in 1948, Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine, Norbert Wiener argued that network systems composed of the elements of people, machines, and ecology could be modeled in electronic networks. With respect to what he perceived to be newly developed advantages in computing machinery compared with the human ability to reason, Wiener had this to say. Let it be remarked that an important difference between the way in which we use the brain and the machine is that the machine is intended for many successive runs, either with no reference to each other or with a minimal limited reference, and that it can be cleared between such runs, while the brain, in the course of nature, never even approximately clears out its past records. Thus, the brain, under normal circumstances, is not the complete analog of the computing machine, but rather the analog of a single run on such a machine. This hints at why De Luca would believe that his simulation of Notre Dame would be superior to the original in facilitating our understanding of the cathedral. The human mind is in fact inferior to these new computers that are appearing in the mid-20th century. Thus, cyberneticists argued that complex simulations that exceed the brain's capacity are enabled by computers. Importantly, these simulations would be controlled by the experimenter, rendering them simpler when warranted. What happens here over time is that there are practical constraints, right? There is this big vision from Wiener. The implementations do not pan out, but there is this sleight of hand. If I simplify things just a bit, it looks like it's working. At Dartmouth in 1956, for a variety of technical and political reasons, including the group's personal dislike of Wiener, parts of the field of cybernetics rebranded as artificial intelligence. But the idea that machines could encapsulate the world around us persisted in the symbolic approaches that would dominate AI in the coming decades. Okay, so what's interesting, if you look at some data, I took Google Ngrams and put in the phrase cultural heritage. You really do not see this phrase in any text until the mid-20th century, just as cybernetics is gaining steam. And of course, right, as a lot of time, money, and effort is placed into virtualizing the world, you see a large uptick in the use of this phrase, which is quite interesting, right? So these things are certainly coupled. But what of the constraints? Recall the Borges story on exactitude in science. Yeah, of course, this is the whole story, right? If you're not familiar with it, you can read it while I go through the spiel. The map in this story has a size that was, quote, that of the empire, and which coincided point for point with it. Complex phenomena may require a model with the same level of complexity as the input, a simulacrum. This doesn't simplify understanding and is, practically speaking, useless. Another reading of this story is also explanatory. The degradation of the map creates a state of confusion in the observer between the signs of the map and the perception of the places those signs were meant to represent. The philosopher Jean Baudrillard calls this effect hyperreality. In this state, neither sign nor place remain, only the hyperreal. A consequence of this is that it becomes impossible to distinguish between the physical world and a simulation of that world in technologically sophisticated societies where exposure to simulation is pervasive. And of course, we live in one of those societies. Writing in the June 2025 issue of Harper's Magazine, the Norwegian novelist Karl Ove Knausgård examined the limits of computer technology, making a pitch for reenchantment instead of rationalism's simulations. He reminds us that, quote, the language of numbers can tell us how something works, but nothing about what something is. It must be experienced. In the ancient Eleusinian cult, the initiates were led into a dark room where they were exposed to a whirlwind of impressions, without anyone telling them what they were seeing or what it meant. But that was only half the initiation. The next half took place the following year when they returned. Now they saw the initiation from the outside, and you could say that only then, when the gaze from within was complemented by the gaze from without, was the initiation completed. What conclusions they drew from it, what they learned and understood, was entirely up to them. Note that Plato was alleged to be an initiate in these very same mysteries. Okay, so to wrap up here, is there anything worth salvaging from this project? Here is our friend Marshall McLuhan, who has a different take on this, right? I think, especially in the Catholic world, you see diverging views on technology. A lot of people are extremely negative. McLuhan is a refreshing voice, I think, if you're more on the negative side. He has a very interesting perspective on what is going to happen in the near future, or at least his vision of the near future as he's writing in the mid-20th century. He's really intrigued by the world of mechanized routines, abstract finance and engineering, which is the consolidated dream born of a wish. But by studying the dream in our folklore, we can perhaps find the clue to understanding and guiding our world in more reasonable courses. What he's imagining here is a synthesis of the old and the new. And he's really interested in the possibilities that are opened up by these advanced technologies that are starting to appear in the 20th century. What can we do in the physical, or what can't we do in the physical world? That's a really interesting question. In this electronic age, according to McLuhan, we see ourselves being translated more and more into the form of information, moving toward the technological extension of consciousness. He has this intriguing idea that in the future, one could project one's imagination to somebody else, right? This is going to accelerate culture. It's not going to be the end of culture. Unfortunately, right, I feel like the implementation didn't quite achieve that, and something went wrong along the way, which is probably related to everything I am telling you about. But the internet is distinctly different from print, radio, and television because it is interactive, allowing projections of the human imagination to become its input. That we have been made in the image and likeness of God means our handiwork, like his, is, at least in principle, good. The internet has always been a project of our subcreation, and therein lies the potential roots for its salvific use. We are a fallen species, but in light of Christ's redemption, a media theorist like Marshall McLuhan can help us think about how to build and wield our technology well. Thus, when we don't abandon the original intent of our communal and sacred spaces, even after they have been virtualized, I think there is some hope. Okay, this talk is drawn from three things I'm just gonna plug real quick to wrap up here, in case you wanna dive into these ideas much deeper than I have in this 15-minute talk. First is the book Virtue in Virtual Spaces, out on Liturgical Press. The second is an essay, which is really a review of Nick Rapatrizzoni's excellent book on McLuhan and the internet. This appeared in the web magazine Athwart. My essay is Transcending Obsolescence on Marshall McLuhan's Catholic Globe. And finally, my book, A History of Fake Things on the Internet, which just went into paperback this month. So check these out. Thank you. We did have this working, folks. I think it's just on the wrong display.
Thanks.
Of course.
Perfect. Thank you. Lucky for us, it's only have one slide, so we're good to go. In fact, thinking about what you just saw, did I mess it up? I can probably explain it. You shouldn't have let me out in public. You know, that really was like, speaking of video games, that was like PlayStation 5 version of a video game. You're about to get an 8-bit version. In fact, if I'm like staying true to Oklahoma, it's more like a video slot machine in a gas station that you're about to get now. Which means we're either gonna have a lot of fun or lose it all. I think it's very appropriate. This sort of, thank you very much, a sort of Wittgenstein-esque talk. Of course, if anybody knows Stanley Hauerwas, he was my advisor, so it makes sense that I'm gonna be diagnosing grammar quite a bit. So back to the rough ground indeed. Okay, if a tradition is a living thing, it should speak to current realities and the challenges those present. I don't think anybody would act like anything should be different. I submit that at least in one sense of tradition, for instance, McIntyre's, I would argue, it can at least be said poetically, if not stronger, that a tradition is the soul of the people as it encounters rival traditions regarding reality, thus containing at least analogously, again, the enumerated powers of the soul. This isn't so silly as we rather easily talk about traditional memory. It's not too much of a leap to think about how rituals passed down are like the habits of the passions which tradition provides for its subsequent adherence. And once more evoking McIntyre, it seems rather straightforward to say that one of the powers of the soul, the intellect, is once again, at least by analogy, available to be said of tradition. The power of a tradition to become adequate to the reality through apprehension and reasoning about reality. And so when a new reality presents itself, as certainly the new world birthed by the digital array has, and when this new medium of communication has, in its new epochal manifestation in artificial intelligence, begun to present a rival account of both the tradition of human thought, i.e. the mere museum of encoded information to be statistically rendered as a standing reserve for token prediction, and an alternative for human intellection as the said operator of the predictive token selection. It's incumbent on our tradition to marshal its many powers to give not only an account of itself, but once again, as McIntyre constantly pointed out, a superior account of why the rival tradition comes to the, albeit flawed, positions it comes to. And so this talk is a small attempt to begin such an account by thinking through the intellectual powers the Catholic tradition must muster. As Cyril O'Regan's talk on Newman and McIntyre masterfully demonstrates, to do this accounting invokes in us, at least at the behest of these two thinkers, a sense of needing to retrieve our tradition. And as the main rival tradition we are considering now is the one brought on principally by a medium, that is digital modernity, as opposed to the print and electric modernity, which we could consider in prior ages, it was very easy to call for aid, to my mind, to once again the Catholic media philosopher Marshall McLuhan, who in his heuristic for pattern perception regarding mediums developed what he calls this tetrad of media effects. Brett in his talk is going to talk even more about this, so I don't want to belabor the point, but there's this idea that McLuhan essentially has is that when you regard the effects of a medium, it's important to regard them, as it were, in 4 cases of the effects that it has, primarily on our sensorium and our senses. But Marshall McLuhan himself always loved expanding his ideas into new terrain. So I don't think he'd be too mad at me considering this in terms of digital tradition versus the Catholic tradition. So when it comes to mediums, I want to say people obviously quickly glom onto the idea that what does this new medium enhance? And certainly we don't need to talk any about how AI is usually, with much marketing prowess, pointed out to us about how much enhancement it brings to life. The fact that it routinely gives me wrong information, be damned. The shiny new toy quality of all new media technologies is of course easy to see. Few, if any, look at retrieval or reversal, both of which we shall marshal, pun intended, for the account of our tradition we hope to give. But it is true that after enhancement, people do point out what they think is made obsolete. And while I think they often miss the good reading of what some things are made obsolete. So for instance, I, as a headmaster, as someone who talks about education quite a bit, think that the dethronement of the essay as the monarch of educational assessment is actually a great thing, but that's a whole other talk besides. But in many ways, even when something is correctly earmarked for obsolescence, the reason this is occurring is often misunderstood. One that I often bring up is that there's a whole array of jobs, sorry young people in the crowd, an array that I as a humanities professor, perhaps with too much glee, like to know, where exactly these jobs in their sort of reality, we were told as humanities departments that we must decrease so that training for these jobs can increase, that they're going to be obsoleted fast. And it's coming, and get ready to cook some fries. And the idea that I'm getting at is that, of course, what this gets often labeled as is a sort of idea that, okay, don't you see that this is a whole brandishment or this aspect of human thought that we need to lop off. And I've pointed this out that I do believe that it's the humanities specifically that are waiting their time in the sun once again to account what is that makes us uniquely human precisely in this time period when the difference between us and robots has at least been clouded, I should say, in popular discourse. But in that realm, I'm more appealing to the fact that Newman and what he says about sciences that understand their own goods for their own sake are the ones that will survive compared to college majors rendered only important by utilitarian objects, utilitarian concerns. In other words, it's not the fields themselves, but the modes by which they are approached that is elemental. And hopefully we'll have time to get to this idea of modes here in a second. But I want to make it careful to make I don't want to make an opposition to say between how the retrieval of the humanities that we hope to have is the obsolescence of the sciences. To pit the humanities versus the sciences is to miss the point completely. In that realm, I am more appealing to Newman, like this idea about the completion of the circle of sciences, but we'll return to that shortly. Alas, like I said, there is a tendency in the face of AI's tremendous powers to regard huge swaths of human intelligence, another word that we should talk about soon, as obsolete, or that it is obsoleting in us. Perhaps the metaphor in this regard is a notion also taken from McLuhan, that if AI is something like a cancer that has infected multiple parts of human thought, we should amputate those limbs of cognition in order to save the parts that have not been solely destroyed, infected. So if it saves the patient, it's worth the cost of casting forth the offending organ rather than, and give it over to AI, rather than let it get into the things that are most important, most human, and continue to infect us. As an example, just to make people mad, I'm going to quote a recent article in First Things by Rusty Reno, The Mediocrity of AI. I want to point out that I'm not interested explicating or arguing against the entirety of his argument here. I, for one, think I probably agree that AI is pretty mediocre and that part of the problem is people, so to speak, hyping it up too much because they have money to make. But this one paragraph that he brings up that was widely quoted on social media, I think is important for us to consider. He includes another important thinker that a lot of people talk about routinely. I'm also going to disagree with him, so just really trying to make myself popular. Reno says, to use Ian McGilchrist's terms, AI is pure left brain. It is calculative and reductive, treating the world as a giant data set. The results can be powerful, providing us with technological leverage over existing things, but the left brain is incapable of analogy, imagination, emotionally colored thinking. Ian McGilchrist, that's a whole other argument we could start to make. But we've heard of left brain, right brain thinking, the general idea that the left brain is sort of calculative and demonstrative and all of that sort of more mechanical sort of reasoning. And then the right brain people are like your aunt who paints, right? And so there's this idea that like AI is totally grabbing onto left brainism, and it's just going to be like if we don't run to the woods and start singing, we're doomed, or something like this, right? I'm being mean, but I'm short on time. There's much of this description, it lends itself to me wanting to agree with it. Certainly, the primary way we understand artificial intelligence is that it calculates, and that it has only come about due to the material capacity to be able to see the world primarily as a data set. Both it has the capacity to do so mechanically, and that has had unrivaled success in things like Bayesian logic and things that we could go on and on about. Statistical probabilities that can be recognized and then utilized as the production of quote-unquote knowledge. But of course, anyone who reads the headlines about some of the most startling aspect of artificial intelligence will quickly note that it is precisely the routine way in which people are tricked into thinking that their JPT actually does make analogies, is rife with imagination, and in fact is emotionally colored enough that they think it's their girlfriend, or that God spoke to them through it, or that they alone are special cupcakes that have made the machine awake. AI psychosis is so real, they're thinking about adapting it into the next DSM, whatever we're on, I don't know. And so that's not that the robot is cold and calculating. What actually messes with most people is that the robot has better soft skills than most of your humanity majors. Seemingly, if what we're saying is it has the left brain covered. And anybody who knows that these things have utilized them, that their whole gambit is to agree with you, they agree with you with analogies, with imagination, and they are actually rather good at emotional language. I have children who are not as emotionally tuned in to how to convince people of stuff than the robots. So, it can't be the case that AI is left-brained and we should sort of hand it over. Again, Reno takes the argument in many directions. I don't want to lambast him particularly. And again, the McGilchrist stuff, that's a whole argument about neuroscience and things that I don't want to get overly worried about. But what I am trying to argue here is that even if unintended, even if unintended, this begins to amputate or break apart what clearly is not the case when it comes to the effect of artificial intelligence, or it's not the complete summation of its effect. But there is something underlying this misconception. And to my mind, it has everything to do with the two modes of how a tradition must respond to the particular arrival of digital modernity as confronted in artificial intelligence. And so it's important, in other words, to speak well about this power of the soul, the intellect, if we are to use it as at least by analogy for the Catholic tradition as it faces its new rival in digital modernity. Here I recall Joseph Pieper in Leisure, the Basis of Culture, where he talks about ratio, what people would probably think of as proximate to what McGilchrist and Reno are calling the left brain, and then intellectus, what Reno wants to preserve, as it were, over AI with the right brain by amputation. Again, I'm not saying he makes that specifically. I'm saying this is an outcome of what I think he's saying. So Pieper says this, quote, "The Middle Ages drew a distinction between the understanding as ratio and the understanding as intellectus. Ratio is the power of discursive logical thought, of searching and examination, of abstraction, of definition and drawing conclusions. Intellectus, on the other hand, is the name for the understanding insofar it is the capacity of the simplex intuitus, of the simple vision to which truth offers itself like a landscape to the eye." But what's most interesting in this that Pieper points out is he wants to say what is most proper to the human is ratio. That it's particularly the ability of human reason, to do these things that makes us human. He even goes on to say that intellectus is what makes us sort of kind of like the angels, because that's how angelic intellect works. The simple apprehension, one, and contemplation that we rightly begin to associate with poetry and art and metaphysical thought. I'm running out of time, but like Pieper gets at this as he goes like, look, this is actually properly human to think of it in that way. But it is precisely the discursive capacity of humans, our ability to, quote, reason from one thing to another and make ratios of relationships and patterns of observation and critical analysis that is most proper to the hylomorphic unity that is the human being, body, and soul. And so out of the gate, it's important not to cede to AI reason and ratio, the left brain, the thing that supposedly, and by the way, Pieper is just being a good Thomist here. I think it's Summa Theologia 1, I think it's question 78 or 79, where he's talking about the intellect, and he points this out. Thomas repeatedly says, in this mode, we are most like ourselves, truly human, and that it's the sort of special privilege of being like the angels when we have simple apprehension in the intellect. So out of the gate, we need to do that. And furthermore, to retrieve the tradition's capacity to speak against digital modernity is to also ask what is the difference between what seems to be the left brainism of generative artificial intelligence and what it is that humans properly do when they reason. And so while I think it's absolutely the case that one of the gifts that gifts that I think God himself allowed artificial intelligence to give us is to serve up on a platter for us the retrieval of the deep importance of the humanities and the arts. And I would never bypass that, and I want to talk about that and promote a book I wrote that's about that. I'm serving that too. The majority of things of which we would probably subscribe to the intellectus mode of our intellect, in some ways, I want to say the more important pressing issue is to understand what makes the ratio of human reason distinct from generative artificial intelligence. That is what has to be pointed out if this is to work. I'm already running out of time, and I knew I would, but so to give short sort of, descriptions of what I think this has to proceed and look like. On one hand, what I would say is the argument about how AIs mimic human ratio is akin to the argument later philosophical investigations Wittgenstein has over against Tractatus Wittgenstein, for the nerds out there. That the idea is when you try to see what AI does, it certainly looks like it's intelligence in intellect, but it's actually probably not. So very quickly, this is a whole talk. I maybe should have made this talk. Intelligence and intellect come from the same etymological categories, and of course, etymology is not destiny. But it's very interesting that out of the two words, you get a sort of bifurcation describing how humans think. And one of them, the intelligence, is the ability to make choices between multiple possibilities. And an intelligent thing is that which chooses well differences between possibilities. The other one, of course, is the intellect, which is the grasp and apprehension of reality itself. And what I want to say is artificial intelligence actually is intelligent, but by prior acts of intellection of humans that put into a mechanical process. I'm at time. The last thing I will say with our ability with the second mode of intellectus is to retrieve earlier modes of media that are now liberated from not needing to be the pressing medium in conversation with the digital media. And this is where books, when they can be grandfatherly, when they can be like grandparents, right? And what's the thing about a grandparent? What do? They can be children again with wisdom this time around. And so that's why, to just sum it up because I have to stop, read books out loud. That will help you over against artificial intelligence. If you need an idea for a book to read out loud, A Very Little Office of Compline by Bo Bonner. Thank you.
All right, so short of some hard drugs, I don't think I can match Bo's energy. So if you feel like you're in need of a nap after that, feel free to do so. So the reception of a tradition implies that there must also be a transmission of tradition. And taken together, we can say that this process of transmitting and receiving a tradition is communicative. As such, there's a way in which the development of tradition can be linked to the development of human communication itself. The communication tradition that begins with the rhetoricians of the ancient world and finds its modern expression in the various schools of media and communications theory of the 20th century can thus be seen as an environment in which tradition is transmitted and received. The development of this communication tradition is the subject of my remarks today, and I'll argue that the development of tradition is a mediated process that reflects the various changes to the human communication environment. So there's a number of moments in the history of communication that very clearly influence the transmission and reception of tradition. And the most iconic example, I think, of this is the introduction of the printing press in the 15th century. As Elizabeth Eisenstein recounts in her magisterial work on this topic, the shift from manuscript to print culture was not a mere technological transformation, but a cognitive and cultural one. Print technology gave rise to a new intellectual and scientific tradition that would not have been possible without the stability and standardization of reproducible texts. Famously, the printing press provided the kindling for the Protestant Reformation, during which the church's tradition of scriptural interpretation became more widely disseminated and democratized. The cultural effect of these changes was nothing less than the birth of a new epistemic order. As a result, the preservation and handing on of tradition was no longer exclusively mediated by oral and communal modes of transmission, but by way of textual authority and standardized artifacts that gave rise to individualized interpretation. Whereas tradition once lived in interpretive communities that generated shared meaning through participation, the printed book allowed the private reader to confront the text and the tradition alone. To take a more proximate example, the reception of the Catholic liturgical tradition in the digital age has proven to be a somewhat paradoxical result of the changes in the communication environment inaugurated by the internet. Somehow, the invention of the most advanced communication system on earth has coincided with large numbers of young Catholics returning to ancient forms of liturgy. What seems like a paradox, young terminally online people seeking out ancient liturgies and devotions, actually says something profound about the digital environment's capacity to represent tradition in surprising ways. If we focus solely on the formal features of the digital environment, ignoring for a moment the content of smartphones and social media, we see a technological environment built on memory storage and retrieval. In its essence, a computer is a memory storage and retrieval device. Growing numbers of Catholics are nostalgic for a liturgy that they never experienced because, as Marshall McLuhan famously put it, the medium is the message. The effect of regular interaction with a medium that operates exclusively on memory storage and retrieval has created the conditions for a retrieval of knowledge and tradition that resemble the mediated conditions of the European Renaissance, when ancient texts were represented in print to the humanists who are now able to more easily retrieve and give new life to ancient thought. Today, ancient sensibilities are being reborn again, thanks to long-buried sources that have been given new life by the digital archive. So what first appears as a paradox may be more accurately seen as a chiasmus or reversal. In his book, Laws of Media, McLuhan moves beyond the facile moral claim that technology is either good or evil, depending on how we use it. Instead, he argues that media have a fourfold epistemological effect, a schema he borrowed from Henri de Lubac's four senses of Scripture and Aristotle's fourfold notion of causality. Instead of the literal, moral, allegorical, and anagogical tetrad for interpreting Scripture, McLuhan translates the tetrad into technological terms. Every new technology enhances or amplifies something, retrieves something from the past, obsolesces a previous practice or technology, and reverses into its opposite when taken to the extreme. The quadrants in McLuhan's tetrad are chiasmic. The chiasmus is best summed up in John Calkin's phrase, "We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us." While a smartphone enhances connection and immediacy, it also reverses into isolation and distraction. While a smartphone obsolesces the experience of local community, it also retrieves a form of tribalism that shows up in non-local groups that form deep bonds in so-called online communities. This diagram locates these lines of force that are present in any media environment, and they set the stage and provide the ground from which new figures emerge. The Latin Mass revival becomes more legible when these lines of force are made explicit. When the ground of social connection moves away from local community, which is being obsolesced under digital conditions, and moves toward online experience, we see social groupings that are more tribalized and atavistic, a natural reaction to a growing sense of isolation and cultural confusion that the internet foments. The fluidity of online information and individual identity ends up reversing chiastically into a desperate search for something more permanent and stable. It's important to note that this atavistic trend is not just evident in liturgical circles, but in politics, Make America Great Again, nutrition and health, paleo and carnivore diets, and education, the growth of classical schools. It should be noted that none of these observations are value statements about any particular cultural movement. They're interpretive examples of how to apply McLuhan's thought to understanding the effects of technology rather than simply moralizing about them. McLuhan sits at an interesting intersection in Catholic intellectual thought and the subject of this paper, the communication tradition. McLuhan is most well known for his aphoristic observations about modern media like television, but his intellectual formation is mostly medieval. His dissertation was on the classical trivium, and he was a self-professed grammarian. McLuhan's ability to marshal, the semiotic insights of ancient grammarians like Augustine and apply it to modern communications media should be a model for those teaching communications in the university. It's a testament to how the most agile minds can traverse centuries of an intellectual tradition, adapt it to modern developments, and preserve its continuity. It's already been stated that the reception of a tradition is highly dependent on the process of communication to establish and maintain a meaningful and shared symbolic world. What's happened over the last century and a half is a gradual displacement of the rhetorical tradition as the locus of teaching the art of communication. In its place, we have what's become known as communication studies, an amalgamation of psychology, sociology, and engineering that presents functional models for communication that are more suited for machines than humans. Among the many critics concerned with this shift is the late media ecologist Neil Postman, and in his essay, The Humanism of Media Ecology, Postman poses 4 questions for evaluating the suitability of different media forms for contributing to thriving culture. First, to what extent does the medium contribute to the uses and development of rational thought? Second, to what extent does a medium contribute to the development of democratic processes? Third, to what extent do new media give greater access to meaningful information? And fourth, to what extent do new media enhance or diminish our moral sense, our capacity for goodness? And I would add a 5th question, to what extent does a medium contribute to the preservation and promotion of a tradition? The answer to this question is not easily found in any particular medium, as we've just demonstrated with the digital and Latin Mass. McLuhan showed us that media are not one-dimensional. Instead, the effects of any medium are best understood in the tension between their countervailing tendencies to both enhance and reverse, or obsolesce and retrieve. A more revealing line of sight can be found in the development of the rhetorical tradition itself. So my chosen field of communication studies is both quintessentially modern and a vestigial remnant of the rhetorical tradition that preceded it. A cursory survey of the discipline reveals a rupture following the Second World War, when the concurrent rise of electronic mass media and propaganda led to the establishment of institutes for communication research at major universities. For the founders of this new field of study, the goal was to convert communication into a measurable and empirical science. This was a far cry from the rhetorical tradition that viewed communication as a form of soul work that included character formation, dialogical encounter, as essential to meaningful human communication. Communication studies stopped asking the question that preoccupied the ancients, what is truth, and instead asked, how do messages move through systems and how do they change attitudes and behaviors? Figures like Wilbur Schramm, who founded communications research institutes at Illinois and Stanford in the mid-20th century, stand at the crossroads of this monumental shift. Schramm was both a rhetorician and a journalist who also wrote fiction and co-founded the Iowa Writers' Workshop. Schramm embodied the last vestiges of the rhetorical tradition while simultaneously inaugurating the modern move toward viewing communication as an empirical science. However, by taking a longer view of these developments, it's evident that Schramm's work was continuous with an early modern development that was inaugurated 500 years earlier by the French humanist and reformer Peter Ramus. The Ramist project was to simplify and rationalize the classical trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric by turning rhetorical art into a technical process of diagrams and sequences that could be mastered through visual outlines and charts. It's no small coincidence that Ramus introduced the visual layout of knowledge as a pedagogical approach following the invention of the printing press. In other words, the visual production of knowledge by a machine provided a framing metaphor for Ramus to transform the classroom into a place of visual learning and standardization instead of a place of oral disputation and dialogue. In his own way, Schramm advances the Ramus project in the 50s by viewing communication as an engineering challenge rather than a metaphysical one. His adoption of the Shannon-Weaver model of communication to remodel the process of persuasion is indicative of this shift. Claude Shannon published a paper at Bell Labs in the late 40s titled A Mathematical Theory of Communication, and for engineering purposes, Shannon recast communication in the electric age as a process of moving bits of information from transmitters to receivers using channels that are subject to noise and technical failures. Information in Shannon's rendering can be quantified probabilistically as being more or less predictable. A message moving from the transmitter to receiver is not understood in terms of its meaning, but by its predictability. A highly predictable message is deemed low information, and unpredictable message is deemed high information. And this model in communication science dispenses with meaning, persuasion, and human interaction, and focuses exclusively on the predictability of bits of information. If this sounds familiar to you, it should be no surprise to learn that Shannon was one of the early pioneers of machine intelligence. Beyond developing a mathematical model for communication, Shannon was already modeling cognition, learning, and problem solving in mechanical terms. His view of intellectual tasks being made up of discrete states and probabilistic choices foreshadows developments in symbolic AI and machine learning. And even Shannon's project owes a great deal of debt to Peter Ramus, who set the stage for the abstraction of communication from embodied ethical relationality to a technique that strips the classical trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric from its metaphysical roots. Meaning is no longer grounded in reality, being, or the transcendent, but in methodological clarity and flowcharts. Rhetoric is no longer participation in the metaphysical act of cultivating the soul for truth-seeking, but a technical process where reasoning can be captured in method, charts, and procedural logic. For Claude Shannon, the media metaphor that was shaping his approach was that of electric circuitry, a closed loop that bracketed out concerns about being, the soul, and communication as a moral act. For Ramus, the media metaphor was that of the printing press, a machine capable of standardizing information and making it replicable. Fidelity was no longer about faithfulness to the truth, but faithfulness to models for reasoning that were as predictable and fixed as the lines of cast metal type in a printing press. All right, to wrap up. So Ramus, Schramm, and Shannon mechanized rhetorical dialogue and human exchange to create a communications system. Their departures from the rhetorical tradition led to an epistemological flattening, wherein the sacred and symbolic depth of communication was replaced by functional models. This historical digression suggests that the transmission, reception, and development of tradition does not float above the media forms and innovations in communication through which it's lived, expressed, and handed on. Rather, tradition is a way of life sustained by forms of communication that shape perception, memory, community, and imagination. The practical implications of this for all of us is the recognition that rejecting technology and romanticizing technology are equally unproductive if we're concerned about the preservation, transmission, and reception of tradition. Rejecting technology in an attempt to live more simply is impossible in a communication environment and culture that's already entirely dependent on it. The cultural effects are inescapable, whether you yourself have a smartphone or not. Romanticizing technology, on the other hand, in an attempt to baptize it for good purposes, only means that what was worth preserving will now be subject to the technocratic logic of technique and efficiency. Between the Scylla and Charybdis of technological change is our ability to recognize those lines of force at work in the shift. What's being enhanced, what's being obsolesced, what's being retrieved. In the end, to study the history of communication is to study the history of tradition itself. Both are concerned with how meaning survives across time. The communication tradition, from Aristotle to Augustine, Ramus to Shannon, is not just a record of changing techniques, but a mirror of the human condition, our perennial struggle to render presence through signs. Every technological epoch reconfigures that struggle, enhancing some dimensions of understanding while obscuring others. Yet through all these changes, the call remains the same: to seek communion through communication and to keep alive the symbolic conversation that binds us to our ancestors and our descendants. Thank you.
Our speakers have generously left us about 21 minutes for questions. So, yes, go ahead.
I got one. First of all, thank you for a superb panel. Great trio there. I think anybody can chime in here, but Bo, this is probably for you. Oh, thank you. I said great panel. Thank you very much. Great trio. That's my radio voice. Bo, this is probably for you. You make a persuasive case against, I think, on the one hand, agentic or sentient AI. Yet, the AI is emotive enough, more than your children, you say, to have a kind of agency. So there's a tension there. And so I'm citing something like, on one hand, it's benign, this emotive, supportive chat GPT character we see, but really that's an illusion. You know, you have cases of a young person looking up suicide and then getting supported in that nice voice and escalating a suicidal ideation.
Yep.
So any thoughts on any of that?
Too many thoughts. One of the things, that's why I sweat so much when I talk, is so you know I'm not a robot. So, you know, I actually think the ratio element, when we get into what does it look like to have a human reasoning about particularities with the AI. So for instance, I think we need to get as specific as, I think it should be illegal for AIs to speak in a voice unless it's your own voice. Precisely because of both what I think is from my colleagues here about the sort of sense ratios that can trick you, because a machine is able to take the dead archaeological finds of prior language and through statistical mechanism repeat meaning that was actually given by a human in a prior time, and that it zombifies, right? Like when you talk to an AI and it's helping you with your suicide, it's a zombie. It is taking dead human producta and reanimating it through statistics. They don't know that, which is why it should be illegal for them to do it. And this to me is gets into your about don't do romanticism and don't do being able to run off in the woods. Is if we who are having these conversations refuse to go try to make legal arguments about the capacity for these things precisely to be given full reign to trick people, you're right. It will seem like it's convincing. It seems like it knows you. I always point this out too, though, right? You know, AI is just like narcissistic people, right? Narcissistic people have also learned to game signification, right? And that's actually the proper psychological understanding of narcissism is to have a sort of separation from the signification of language itself, that you use it to manipulate people without being invested, as it were, in a participatory manner. So we made a robot who's a narcissist, who also has no soul, and can only sort of repeat what inputs you put into it. And so I agree with you, it's extremely dangerous. And I think that we should be talking about what laws we demand the people who make it, the guide rails it puts in. It's the same thing with a car. Your kid has to learn to crawl before they walk, before you're not gonna give a 2-year-old a Ferrari. And we've made the Ferrari, or maybe the V8 rocket ship of communication, and we're have fun, 3-year-olds. And that should be technically illegal. I think you should be able to smoke and drink before you use AIs.
Howdy, this is fabulous. I have grandchildren, and when I put on Looney Tunes, they run screaming from the living room. So I'm thinking of McLuhan's example of some indigenous people not being able to see film, and our adaptation of our perceptorium. Reading to kids aloud, or to adults aloud, sure, that's good. Laws, that's good. But what else can we do to at least monitor or deal with the modifications of our perceptorians?
Brett said, read my book, not me. Both of our books.
Yeah, so this is a question I hear a lot as a technologist, and I think the real question here is, again, how do we live well with technology? I think part of the answer to that is rejecting the mainstream culture around technology, and that, of course, would mean pulling back and reading books, but you can't have a complete disengagement. But that leaves you with an unsatisfactory situation because these technologies kind of want to suck you back in, right? Like, there's just tremendous emphasis on the customer capture, right? And then again, it comes into all the surveillance stuff I'm talking about, right? Like, how is the money being made? So that seems to suggest we need an alternative set of technologies. And this is what I challenge our students here at Notre Dame to do, right? It's like, got a whole program in computer science and engineering. What if we could figure out how to work with established virtues as we build technology? And I'll shout out Louisa Conwell, who is standing in the back, who is working on this in my laboratory and has done just incredible work within the area of areas of human-computer interaction and software engineering to try to create these templates, right? So I think, could you build an alternative ecosystem, right, more localized, emphasizing the strengths of these technologies, like, as Brett mentioned, right, like bringing people together. It's the communication that's most attractive. Why is the internet so popular? It's because we can talk to other people, right? It's not because we can buy things there. It's not because we do work there, right? Those are really bland and superficial things. The internet takes off because it is this radical innovation in communication. So preserving that, but trying to get through all of this noise, and again, these kind of obnoxious business plays, parasitic business plays on top of the larger business plays, I think that is a reasonable path forward. And again, coming to some kind of consensus, at least maybe within the Catholic world, like what is a reasonable relationship with technology, right? Again, you can't just pull back. Like, everybody who tells me they do that is lying, right? Because I see them playing on their phones after they say they don't use the internet, right? Go figure.
I mean, going back to your virtual physical thing, I mean, I think you can build, I mean, as a parent, physical environments in your home that lend themselves to the proper phases of development for a child. So foregrounding things like bookcases, not televisions, like in your living room. So put the television, relegate it somewhere else. And also pay attention to these developmental phases in childhood. It's not appropriate for iPads, AI, and so on to be in the hands of a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old. So hold that line, and if you can't do it alone, find other parents in your school, in your community, that are willing to hold it together and create smaller collectives, subsidiarity style, to have that kind of experience. I think my son's in the room. We didn't have any media for like the first, I don't know, 7 or 8 years of his life. I was doing a media experiment. And he's now at Notre Dame. He's in architecture. He's a sculptor. He's a blacksmith. He learned all of these sort of physical, material, tactile sorts of things because he was bored and wanted to do things. And I think there's something to that. And he has a smartphone. It's not like he's some kind of Luddite romantic. So I think there's ways in which if you preserve those early developmental phases for the things of the real, then the virtual isn't quite so cancerous.
And I think that, like, with schools, so I mean, at the school, Mother of Good Counsel, we're definitive about the developmental stages of media and talking about like how that works. So, send your kid to Des Moines. The one that I think we can all do tomorrow, though, is to use their technologies wrong, like the way they don't want it. My favorite example of this is when they let like white trash Okies on Facebook like start selling their crap. Have you ever been to Facebook Marketplace? You can tell that like every time someone buys like a dilapidated whatever, there is a tech lord in Silicon Valley who dies a little. And I think that we need to ruin their stuff as much as possible like that. Facebook Marketplace, talking about meeting weird people and having discussions, is absolutely delightful. It's the closest thing we have to old farmers drinking coffee at the gas station. And we did that. And so we have to be willing to do that too. We have to be willing to trash out the place, like the media environments. Throw a little trash around. Get comfortable.
Gentleman in the back there, Jay, Martin.
Thank you. So I have a question that's only sort of, apparently for Bo. But at the end of your talk, Bo, you talked about the late Wittgenstein, critiquing the early Wittgenstein. And I thought there, one aspect which, you know, was I found chilling when I read Wittgenstein early, but the idea of like, after all of this, all the sort of positivistic stuff he gives, his sort of maxim is like, we must pass over everything else in silence. And so I thought about, you know, a lot of the sort of specification that we're doing with, you know, making distinctions between ratio and intellectus. But there's a way in which AI has, you know, I think we see the effects, especially in higher education, of simply an implicit way of communicating almost in an unconscious valuation of silencing, of just sort of saying like these things, because they're not able to be put into an algorithm or produced by an algorithm or recognized, and it's just, we become conditioned to kind of accept these things that we're told that we should pass over in silence. So I wondered, all three of you, and Walter, your book sounds amazing, about just maybe, do you find that there's a sort of implicit silencing procedure that's just taking out, you know, is shrinking the data set, if you would?
Okay. So I think there's wicked silence and there's blessed silence. And like silence is actually the primary medium. God spoke the entire world through silence. And I actually think the reason that AI silences us is because actually our most atrophied spiritual power is silence. And so another thing you can do with your grandkids is just silence and make them comfortable with silence. It's the one thing that everything is destroying now. I think it was Bernano who said the modern world is a vast conspiracy against the interior life. And that's what we have. Like, so silence is primary in all of that. But as far as like Wittgenstein late versus early, you know, I love his idea about like a form of life. Like Wittgenstein famously said that even if a lion could talk, we wouldn't be able to understand it because the form of life would be different, which actually to me is why I know artificial intelligence isn't alive, is because we understand it. And it shouldn't have the form of life we do. It has no sensory input. I mean, we can get into like the very technical, well, you could do it much better than I could. I'd be acting like I knew. But the technical details, right? The fact we understand it shows it's actually not a form of life. It's just aping ours. It's the stochastic parrot. I'm saying it wrong. Stochastic parrot. Thank you. It's a zombie, and that's why we can understand it. And so to let the zombie silence what only we can do in order to make more money is precisely like the marching orders we all have to stand against, I believe.
Yeah, I think they're just to weigh in real quick. I think there is a little connection here to the idea again of like safetyism. You know, again, there's this simpler virtual world, right? We don't want people being loud and naughty in the physical world, right? So I think the real silencing is not necessarily in the virtual space; it's here, right? It's around us. And you know, again, you can yell into the internet, you can yell at the LLM. I mean, that's noise, right? But the silence is here, right? It's in this physical space. I don't know if Brett has anything to say on that.
Silence.
You win.
Other questions? Let's see. Yes, sir. Right back here. Yeah, you had your hand.
Great, thank you all. Wonderful panel. I got Walter. Could you say a little bit more about cultural heritage? My familiarity with that concept is from realms like cultural heritage law, which have nothing to do with this domain. That's a domain that has much more to do with Native American communities negotiating with corporations about land and water, or museology, or even the repurposing of like sacred spaces where churches that no one goes to, et cetera. So all of those domains are called cultural heritage, and particularly cultural heritage law is a pretty enshrined field. So I was kind of surprised at your usage of the term, and the engram I think is a bit misleading because it might conflate all of those varieties. And then for Bo and Brett, I'm wondering whether you see any other forms of AI besides Gen AI. I mean, I think Gen AI is like fundamentally, like there's just no hope for like responsible AI in that domain just because of not just the water and land problems, but theft. And, even if you made transparent all the sources, I have questions as to whether we could think about responsible use of Gen AI. But what about other forms of AI? And I think just, like firms like OpenAI have colonized our imagination around the term and made us reduce all AI to this thing. But there's all kinds of other stuff. So I'm just wondering what you think about the other modalities of AI.
I'll start with the first one. So this is a good point. You hear this term cultural heritage used in different contexts. I argue that they're all related, though. And again, there's this turn when this phrase appears away from the original intent of all of the spaces, even like the land, right? You know, something has changed drastically in the culture that we need some kind of legal apparatus to start working through it, that we need to preserve these things because some aspect has disappeared. And this talk is really looking at the evolution of this, like to the point where now you mostly hear this term, at least in academia, around digital technologies. You know, again, it's like we need to get this stuff into the internet, right? But I think it really starts with some of those legal questions about, right, like the restructuring of native populations around the globe, right? Like what to do, right? They can't, you know, persist the way they have. And of course, right, their own cultures have evolved. Again, that's part of this process.
To borrow from the French Revolution, if we could hang the last essay with the innards of the last memo, I think that's great. If AI could just make it where we never have to write memos to each other again, so that we could do anything else. And I'm not even lying. Like, I think about the amount of my time and how much diabetes I have from worrying about memos. That if a machine would do it, I would pass that law tomorrow. But I even mean this with the essay very seriously. It's crazy to me that for 100 years we taught kids to write in an algorithm. That's what I've taught composition. I was teaching kids algorithms, 5-paragraph monsters, like whatever variant you want. It was algorithmic thinking. And then we made a computer that did it better and we're surprised. One that was trained off of a lot of those essays that all of you uploaded to turn it in, by the way. And so this to me, and like, I mean, I love writing, I love reading, I teach great books. I'm not trying to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. But if AI could clear the deck for us to say that there's something that we can do with our enumerated human powers other than the sort of ephemera that we've like built up, the scaffolding of business process, culture, administration. I mean, that's a really easy one, it seems to me, but in deeper ones, right? Like, so like, how prediction works. Like, I'm glad that they seem to be getting better at predicting the weather. I'm worried that it seems like everybody who's in finance can keep making money even when the economy should turn down because they're clearly using predictive AI to make their market bets. And then I'm really worried about like how AI, obviously in ways that we're not being told, makes people make decisions about military gambits, right? So it's actually like GPT is not even the most worrisome use of AI. But I do think that if I never have to write a memo again, I will kiss whatever robot you put in front of me.
Yeah, and just real quick, I mean, AI was happening in finance 30 years ago, and we weren't paying attention because it was just numbers happening, you know, kind of invisibly, and it wasn't until it got language, I think it's Revelation 14, when the beast gets language, and things get really dark. So the anthropomorphizing is a problem, but it's already in finance, manufacturing, medicine. We should pay attention to those. Like, what are the sort of ethical debates there? How can we regulate that and think about that? And then just interface, which we didn't get to talk about, but there's other interfaces other than chatbots that might make sense.
Thank you. I would say great panel, but at this point you might think it's coming from generative AI for as frequently as it's come up. I've been reminded by Neil Postman's line in Amusing Ourselves to Death that at the time of television, communication changed primarily from actual communication of information to entertainment. And I wonder what you guys think about the idea that AI is mostly exposing the fact that our entertainment, our quote-unquote culture, is largely shallow. Like, I'm tempted to say that if ChatGPT came out in the Renaissance, it actually would be much harder to tell which was written by Dante and which was written by ChatGPT. But as many people have pointed out, it writes like a marketing copywriter. And so I wonder if you think that in some ways ChatGPT actually is exposing the fact that much of our, like, what we call culture, our entertainment, isn't actually particularly profound, isn't particularly human, but is rather something like that is replicable by a computer.
I think you gotta kind of put a little asterisk on that, though. It's really the culture found on the internet, right? And especially like the most prevalent cultural artifacts on the internet. Because again, the AI only has access to what's there. As I just mentioned, like a lot of the internet is just noise, right? So I don't know. It's hard to separate a lot of that noise from like genuine cultural material. Of course, there's like low culture, high culture. I think that's kind of interesting though, because like it is a reflection of that stuff, right? It gives you kind of a meta level understanding of that material. But I agree. It seems kind of shallow if you really expected the Renaissance, right, to come out of that.
And I would commend to you a speech that he gave to some German computer scientists called "Informing Ourselves to Death," which is kind of a riff on amusing. But I think the two are conjoined. I think the new medium sort of kind of swallows the old medium and represents it, and so we do get this very televisual experience on social media and now even AI. It's the entertainment paradigm that we've inherited.
And then there's a talk that Brett and I gave a few years back at the ethics conference that like gets at this idea that so God in his great providence for us has decided at this time to give us a mirror that shows everything we hate about ourselves. And it's very important for you to remember that if you hate something you've seen on the internet or AI, it is only because a prior human did it or wrote it. And half the time when we go like, this AI is another way to say this statistical propagation of something a human already did. And so in that regard, when it, and I mean, like, I'm not even trying to be blue here, but like Harry Frankfurt's book on bullshit, which is like very, like, I mean, it makes, it uses words to hide behind, like, which is Frankfurt's main point. And so when the thing naturally, its mode is BS, that's not AI's, that's a condemnation of us. And God has given us this mirror to look at ourselves and appropriately be frightened and try to do something about it.
Well, that brings us to the end of our time.